Chapter 7, Processes and Personality. So one of the basic personality traits that we talked about is extroversion. So high level extroverts prefer to company of other people, um, parties and activities and large groups and those sorts of things. The person at the low end of the extroversion scale, also called an introvert, prefers the quiet evenings at home, a quiet dinner with one or two friends, those sorts of things. One of the early researchers in this field, Hans Eysenck, nice fellow that he was, um, looked at basically argued that this difference was related to different levels of brain functioning. That, as it says there, that extroverts had a lower level of basal cortical activation, introverts higher basal cortical activation. So that essentially the extroverts there have less activation there in the brain, and so have to seek out situations with lots of stimulation for them to get to a particular level of stimulation. On the other hand, the introvert, there's already a pretty high level of the basic level of activation is already pretty high. And so just a little bit of stimuli, couple of close friends having dinner together, gets them to the same level of activity that the extrovert needs a much higher level of activity to achieve. Um, so basically creating these different kinds of patterns of behaviors, here's, the introvert may love this movie called My Dinner with Andre, it's an old one. Not expecting y'all to know it's not old in the sense of 1940s, but it's old where it's about a guy who has dinner with a friend named Andre. The guy movie begins with the guy waiting for him to come over. He shows up. They have dinner. They talk. At the end of dinner, they're done. The guy leaves. The introvert may be going, yeah, this is great. It's the whole movie is just about them having an interesting conversations. This is great. The extroverts are going, what the hell is the most boring thing ever? Come on, when's the space monster going to show up? Isn't he going to find out that he's actually they're dating the same person, and then they imitate one another on social media? No, none of that mess going on. So no, it's. So different levels of type of interest there as far as introverts and extroverts. Um, but created by or caused by those different patterns of behavior caused by the different levels of biological functioning, different levels of biological activity in the brain. Um, Neuroticism here, looking at the same sort of idea, this time in terms of emotion centers. Now, to kind of tie all this together, there's two different brain systems here, and so a behavioral approach system and a behavioral inhibition system. One of the interesting things about a lot of you would think we'd have one system that would do both, things that would inhibit you from doing something, and a system that would have you approach something, that it would be the same, sort of the opposite ends of the pole. But it doesn't work that way. A lot of the things about human physiology rather, is separate systems. So we have a system that sort of drives you to approach something, then a separate system that drives you to avoid something. So the behavioral approach system, or BAS, looking at things to attract you to a particular situation. It's focused on positive outcomes. Some people have a very sensitive BAS system, and they're always looking for things to go toward something, looking for great, positive outcomes, things that they want. Others, and then you have a behavioral inhibition system, which is looking at particular risks, damages, bad stuff that could happen. What would happen if you do this? Well, some bad thing might occur, and so it's always, inhibiting you from those particular things. So different people, different levels of activity at these different levels, and so some persons are primarily set up, to sort of as it says there, high BIS or behavioral inhibition system sensitive people. So they're looking for particular risks and threats. Others looking for positive outcomes and those sorts of things. So you can sort of see here where some persons who, act without thinking of the consequences would, how those persons would kind of fit into that sort of category here. Related sort of characteristic of this is the individual difference or personality trait or factor assessment. Marvin Zuckerman is the researcher associated with this idea of sensation seeking. And it's a characteristic where you would score high on sensation seeking or low on sensation seeking. And it's as it says there, high sensation seekers. I mentioned in an earlier video, Busch Gardens has a new roller coaster this particular year. So high sensation seeking people are going, yeah, I want that. That sounds great. Those low in sensation seeking going, no, that's okay. I don't really need to do anything like that. So you can see what high sensation seekers are likely to do and what low sensation seekers are likely to do. Seems to be related to different levels of chemicals that I have a difficult time pronouncing, and so I'm not even going to try to say that. Different level of neurotransmitter functions, MAO. That's why they use the letters there. So indeed, looking for different kinds of situations, and this plays out, and you can get that from the textbook. You don't need me. Excuse me. And then serotonin levels connected here to impulsiveness. There's not much I can really add to this. The textbook kind of discusses this. There really isn't more that I can go to work into that. Likewise, we see a lot of research looking at hormones and their connection to personality. So different levels of testosterone affecting the behavior of humans. The developmental, one of the statements there on the slide, developmental default is female. This is frequently missed on tests that I give. I'm not sure whether that item will come up in the random tests quizzes that you take or not. The basic default human form is female. If the developing embryo, if nothing is done to it, it will develop as female. It requires exposure to, as it says, androgens, the hormone, for there to be an appearance of male physical, male genitalia, and changes to the brain. The default form is female. Male is or essentially a mutation. There's most birth defects and different other things that can happen much more commonly to males than to females, because males are the genetic mutation. We exist for reproductive purposes, and that's it. That's our primary function. We're not as valuable. We are our genetic mutation. Sorry, that's the way that is. So the basic human form is female. Yes, I know that contradicts with the story you were told in. It depends on what religious persuasion you were exposed to as a kid, if you were exposed to any. But certainly Western religion tends to go with this idea of man as being first, which of course some guy wrote it, so of course he decided he was first. But anyway, the developmental default is female, and you have exposure to these hormones, to androgens, to change, and at different levels or different exposures will produce long-term changes in personality, as reflected there in the research. Likewise, at looking at elevated levels of testosterone and affecting behaviors. Again, keep in mind we're talking here about correlations, so it's not the case that, here's a group of people who have high testosterone, thus they're all going to have these other characteristics. It's here's a group of people who have elevated levels of testosterone. Some of those persons will have these characteristics. They're more likely, but it's not going to determine that they're going to be those things. Obviously, an NFL player and trial lawyer are very different characteristics. So we have lots of things going on there. And certainly testosterone levels change as a result of behaviors or experiences in the environment that folks are. I mean, this is how we work. We the different chemicals. It's not a matter that, oh, you have testosterone, oh, you have high testosterone, just you always have high testosterone. No, it's not like that. It changes depending on what's happening in the world around you, the situations you find yourself in. We are biological beings. We are chemical things. We are electrical activity in the brain. That is us. So when something happens that makes you happy, then you get additional activity in the brain that's related to happiness. Hormones or neurotransmitters that are associated with pleasure, their levels increase in the brain. You didn't get happy because of those things happening in the brain. Rather, it was the experience of happiness that is the outside situation, and it's reflected in what's happening there in the brain. I talked enough about evolutionary psychology in the last chapter, so I don't think there's anything to add to it here in this particular situation. Although it does again play up for that same idea of the cultural evolution versus biological evolution. That aggressiveness in the past was something that was a great way to establish dominance and increase status. In today's society, as it says there on the slide, dominance and status are defined, socioeconomically. High levels of testosterone actually interfere with socioeconomic advancement. So, getting angry and throwing something may establish it's if you're a gorilla out in the in the woods or whatever in the jungle, pounding your chest and throwing stuff around establishes you as the dominant alpha male. If you go into a boardroom and do that, you're not going to be there very long. They're going to drag you out. That will not establish dominance in that particular environment. So testosterone there is actually a hindrance to it. One of the interesting components, one of the things that you've certainly have heard about in the past is this fight or flight response. That when threatened animals engage in a fight or flight response, testosterone levels increase, adrenaline, and all this sort of stuff fire up, getting you ready to fight with whatever you're dealing with, whatever the threat is, or to run away from it. Run away, that sort of stuff. Interestingly, a lot of that, as it says up here, most research that's looked at that was done with males, and ignored the fact that, well, women might respond differently, and indeed, so we see this other hormone, oxytocin, so referred to here as basically it's social bonding characteristics, and so it's different levels that affect us in terms of not the fight component, but rather the, as it says there, tend and befriend. If it reflects different evolutionary pressures on males and females during their offspring investment. If you, as it says, males can fight or flee from a particular, predator, rival, troop, or whatever you're, dealing with in that situation. But if you have a offspring, a child to care for, those sorts of situations, then fighting is not necessarily going to be effective, and certainly fleeing without taking care of the person, your offspring, is not going to be helpful. So it's looking at a bonding characteristics. One of the things that can be problematic here in talking about this is the idea that men are this way and women are this way, and really there's much more overlap between men and women, their behaviors. Oxytocin and testosterone are present in both men and women, and produce some of the same effects in men and women. And so there are, just as there are hormonal changes in women in childbirth, there are hormonal changes in men in terms of as becoming fathers in those situations. So lots of different stuff going on here. Do not oversimplify this as men are this way, women are that way. There's a great deal of overlap here, and all of this affects us. Biological processing perspective is all about assessment, tons of assessment, brain activity, physiological measurements, and all of that, and lots of medical research trying to look at identifying particular physiological characteristics that are associated with behavioral problems and issues, and trying to intervene. A lot of times, a lot of this focuses on changing these biological functions, but it really is important to understand that you know, if you are depressed, then yes, there are certain level changes in brain activity we will see, and certain changes in different neurotransmitter levels. And if you take antidepressants, then that can alter some of that activity in those particular brain regions as well as neurotransmitter levels. However, cognitive behavioral therapy, where you talk about the particular problem or issue and engage in a variety of behaviors to address the depression, um, that that will also alter activity in those same regions of the brain and also alter those neurotransmitter levels. So just because something is a biological, that we can see it manifest it in hormones, neurotransmitters, and brain function, does not mean it's caused by hormones, neurotransmitters, and brain functions. So it's there's we can intervene, and if we can intervene by changing, electrically stimulating perhaps a certain region of the brain, yes, that will cause a change in behavior. But we could also have had you go out and take a nice walk through the park, and that would have also changed brain activity in that particular region of the brain. So again, just because something's biological doesn't mean that that's actually the cause of what you're looking at. All we have time for now. Look forward to your questions.